Morning. Morning and welcome. Apologies. I thought I was going to get a countdown 10 to 1, but we seem to be straight in. So morning, welcome to the PASA GMP Equalisation Webinar Series, Implementation Experiences. As the title says, GMP equalization can be easy as BCD, apparently. So that's going to be the challenge for Akash and Tom. We have nearly 400 people registered, which indicates how much interest there is in the topic. The market is generally stuttering towards actually equalizing GMPs. We've noticed lots of schemes with who are heading towards buyouts, have been compelled to move much more quickly. But when I speak to people across the market, trustees, administrators across the industry, most schemes are delaying progress. Some people are worried about the complexity around options. Others are concerned about costs. And of course, there are the resourcing issues because there's so many schemes trying to do the same thing simultaneously. So speaking today, we've got Akash Rooprai from ITS, and we've got Tom Yorath from Aon. Akash has over 25 years of pensions experience. He's a qualified actuary, is a director of ITS, leading on a range of pension schemes, variety of sizes and circumstances. He's the practice lead at ITS for professional corporate sole trusteeship. Tom, on the other hand, was expert witness in the 2018 and 2020 Lloyd's case, so really at the sharp end of things. He leads Aon's GMP equalization team. He is leading the implementation of equalization for a number of multi-billion-pound schemes, either as incumbent advisor or as an independent expert. He sits on the PASA steering group for GMP equalization, chairs the Society of Pensions Professionals Defined Benefit Committee, and is a member of Society of Pensions Professionals Council. Akash and Tom are well placed to talk us through the industry view on implementing GMP equalization. The structure of today is they will both present their own views on implementation of GMP equalization. And then we'll open the floor to questions. However, as they are going through their viewpoints, feel free to send in your questions via the chat function. No need to wait for the end. And then, once they've completed their sections, we'll pull through the key questions and respond accordingly. So over to you, Akash.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Giresh. Welcome to this session. So as Giresh said, I've made the rather bold proposition that GMP is equalisation is as easy as BCD. Now, we all know GMPs are complicated. I once described GMPs to a trustee as if you think of a pension as a smooth circle in shape, the GMP is a complicated odd shape within it that can change both shape and size depending on when you stop contracting out, so whether that be leaving or retirement, and the date on which you cease contracting out, etc. So we all know GMPs are complicated. GMP equalisation is another layer on top of that, but what we're going to hope to do is demonstrate through the experience I've had as a professional trustee and Tom has had as a consultant that GMP equalisation projects can be relatively easy, so not easy in absolute terms, but you can cut through some of the difficulties, hopefully. As Giresh said, put your questions in as you think of them as we go through this presentation, and then we can pick them all up as we get towards the end. So the areas we're going to cover today I'm going to start with, well, first of all, assuming that everybody knows what a GMP is, not necessarily the detail, but at least we don't have to explain what a GMP is. I'm going to do a brief introduction, 60 seconds effectively, on the different methodologies, so that's a little challenge in itself. But I'm not going to go into too much detail as we go through this, because I want to effectively show how in practice, you can do these projects relatively simply if you break them down in the right way. So the focus will be on making projects easy, looking at why things are difficult or appear difficult, but then how do we make them easier, looking at different project stages, and then Tom will pick up his own experience of implementing GMPs in practice. So thinking about the different methodologies, so I've put a little spotter's guide, as I say, about 60 seconds here on the different methodologies. I'm going to assume that people are at least broadly familiar. So I've called method A ratcheting up. So if you think about the cash flows for a male and then a cash flows for if that person was female, the GMP and the non-GMPs are going to be different. That's the nature of the inequality. Method A ends up paying more than either of those two lines, whatever happens, because you do sort of increases each year based on the higher of the male and female. Method B compares those two lines of income streams and just pays the higher. So if one's always higher, that's always paid. If there's a crossover, then when the crossover happens, you just pay the higher income. Method C, the easiest way to describe it, it's like method B, but where you have a crossover, you effectively bank the extra before the crossover, and then you take credit for that until you've used up any excess, and then so basically you pay the higher of those two income streams, but you bank the credit before you get to any crossover. And then method D is conversion, so you change what is GMP to something that's not GMP. It may look very different or may look very similar, but it's not GMP anymore, and you lose some of the complexity. So that's literally it. I'm not going to go into any more detail. So moving on to why does GMP equalisation seem very difficult? For a start, it's GMP, isn't it? And as I've just said, GMP is a complex beast. It's a funny shape within the smooth circle of a pension that changes size and shape over time. Also, you need to go back a long way. If you're doing conversion, you need to go back to 1978, so that's 43 years ago, and there's a lot of records potentially to go and get. Data, we all know that data in pension schemes can be a bit of a challenge. Data can go missing, it can be incomplete, it can be wrong. So that can be a challenge in itself. I'll just say the two words, anti-franking. Anti-franking makes things more complicated. Administration practice, so again, this is not just confined to GMP, but how administration is done can deviate both from the rules and from legislative requirements, and that can vary over time. So you may discover things that you didn't know were wrong as you go and start looking for data. Also, most schemes, or all schemes that have been involved in have GMPs and are going to have to do equalisation have been involved in GMP rectification. A lot of schemes are still going through that process. So you will have other projects that you are doing. Some schemes are looking at risk transfer, buy-ins and buyouts. Some are doing member options. So as well as doing GMP equalisation, you're going to be potentially looking at other projects. And then you have the dilemma of, are you going to try and do GMP equalisation whilst you're doing the other projects, effectively changing the wheel on a car that's still moving, or are you going to do them sequentially? Another challenge is some of the solutions, so B and C, mean you have multiple records for a member. At present, when you pay a pension, you have a single record, effectively broken up into tranches, but for each member you have a single record and a single amount that you have to keep hold of and then increase it each year. With methods B and C, you will have to have multiple records for each member. So that's why it's complicated. So how can we make GMP equalisation easier? Or as some people have said, how do you eat an elephant? It's a big thing, you break it up into chunks. That's the only way you can do it. So this is the way I've done it in the projects I've been involved in. So this is not to say this is the only way to break up the project, but this has worked well for me. So I split the project. I'm going to cover these in a bit of detail in the next slides, but I break the project into 3 stages, and stage 2 I've broken into A and B, and you can do those 3 stages sequentially, one after the other. You can combine 2A and 2B, or you can even combine stage 1 and stage 2. So stage 1's the methodology, stage 2 is a little bit more detail, and stage 3 is once you've gone through all that process, is actually implementing it so that you're updating the records and you're paying the arrears to members who are due arrears. And like many decisions we make as trustees, we always have to balance pragmatism and risk. As I touched on earlier, you might have to go back 43 years and you've probably got incomplete data unless you're very lucky. And therefore, you're not going to, in some cases, in most cases, it's going to be impossible to get all the data you might ideally need. Therefore, you're going to have to balance pragmatism and risk. Now, a lawyer might say to you, you have to do everything you can to get all the information and do it accurately, and that's fine in theory, but in practice you just may never be able to do that. So you're just going to have to balance that pragmatism versus risk, and take decisions as we do all the time as trustees. So then moving on to the first stage, as I've described it. So this is methodology and setting up the project. So you need to think about the method you're going to use. Now, sometimes that might involve doing some data work. Sometimes you can get to the method quite easily. And you're going to need your advisor input into this, your actuarial advisor and your legal advisor principally, but also your administrator who's been used to dealing with the data for usually many years. So we've already touched on the methods. So there's methods A, B, C, and D. I've rather boldly put forget method A. I don't think anybody has even thought about doing it. It is the most expensive in benefit terms, and I don't think any administrators are actually gearing themselves up to use it, or indeed insurers for those who are looking at risk transfer. I'm not aware of that. Clearly, if you're thinking about that, speak to your advisors and they'll probably tell you not to do it. Then you look at either a multiple income, multiple record method where you're looking at different cash flows and paying the right one to members. So that's method B or method C, or you're looking at conversion. And typically the debate has focused on either method C2 as the multiple income or the multiple record method, or method D as conversion. And I put here, don't dismiss method B too quickly. So method B, as I explained earlier, is like method C2, but it's simpler. So the benefit cost will either be slightly more than C2 or the same. Occasionally, it might be materially more. So when you're going through that process with your advisors, think about method B, because it is going to be simpler administratively. It may be cheaper administratively, but it's also less risky. And if you think about the administration of these multiple records that we will have, the administrators who are going to be dealing with these records over the next few decades, most of them will have been born after GMP ceased to accrue. So you can see that there's potential risk there in having, people call method C2 dual records. It's quintuple records. It's 5 sets of records for each individual. And you can see that there might be some risk in the administration if you make it too complicated. But method C2 is the only one you can do without getting employer consent. So that's why you might consider it. As you go through that discussion with your advisors, it may be obvious in having that discussion that there is a standout method. It might be method C2, it might be method B, or it might be method D that seems like the obvious one to go for. And if you've had that discussion, you can then frame the instruction to the advisors in that way. So you could say, rather than do me a paper on methods A, B, and C and D and all the pros and cons, you can say, do me a paper on why not C2 or why not D. And that way the advisory process is more efficient. An alternative is that you might have that discussion and it may be obvious that conversion is definitely not the way to go, but you're going to weigh up between B and C or something like that. Again, it just enables you to have a more efficient advisory process. Then in terms of project planning, think about everything else you've got on the go. And I've touched on this earlier. You may be finishing off your rectification. And in that context, you may be thinking, well, I've nearly finished my rectification, I'll finish that, and then I'll do equalisation. And that's fine. But where you're looking at correcting members' benefits, some will be affected by both rectification, which could be up or down, or an equalisation, which is up only. And for those people who are getting a reduction through rectification and then an increase through equalisation, it's a much easier message to offset them and say, here's your new pension, it takes account of these two things. It's also much easier to write to members. As soon as you use the word or the phrase GMP, you've probably lost them already. So it's easier to write to them once to say this is what we're doing than write to them twice. Then there's also other projects you may be doing. As I said, you may be going through a bulk annuity, you may be going through member options. So think about your projects, think about which ones you're going to do at the same time and which you're going to do sequentially. And then I put segregation on there. So it may be appropriate in some schemes where you've got different issues affecting different members that use a different approach for different groups of members. So you may segregate the membership and you may do conversion for some members, and you may do a multiple income method, a multiple record method for others. So these are all the things you would discuss in what I call stage 1. So moving on to stage 2. So stage 2 picks up all the detailed decisions. So we've done the high level decision there, and then we look at the detail. So 2A is that first line is what the first line is what I call the calculation approach, or the calculation method. So the ideal solution, if you're looking at your pensioners, deferred's are relatively straightforward. Once you've decided your method, you do the calculation on the opposite sex and you just change the record. For pensioners, you've got an income you're paying out, so you're going to have to correct that. So the easiest way to know you've got it right is to reconstruct all the pension, the tranches, at the point the member stopped contracting out. So whether that's retirement or whether that's leaving. And if you can do that, then you calculate the correct pension, you calculate each year's income on the corrected pension, the equalised pension, on all the different tranches. You've got 2 income streams, you compare the 2, add up all the differences, and that's your arrears payment, and then you've got new tranches for ongoing payments. Now, of course, if you're going to try and do that, you need data back at the point the member ceased contracting out, and that's not always going to be available. So the other method is to take the pension you're paying at the moment, which is almost certainly correct, and then roll that backwards with the increases that you've paid across the different tranches, and then allow for revaluations if the person left before retirement, allow for GMP step-ups, complications to do with cash, etc. So roll it all back and then correct and then roll forwards. And that seems to be the most common approach that's being used. But it's a decision you have to take. So you talk to your advisors, you make that decision. And then all the others on this slide are what I call 2B. Now, as I say, you can do this all together. So deaths that happened in the past where pension that was paid was unequal because of GMPs. What are you going to do? Are you going to go back and look at all of them and try and correct who you're going to pay those additional amounts to? Are you going to have a cut-off where before a certain period you're not going to deal with deaths, but you're going to deal with the more recent ones? What about past payments for pensioners? Are you going to go back all the way to the first payment, or are you going to limit that? And you'll need to take some advice on that. Transfers in, so receiving schemes that have received transfers in are going to have to equalise all the benefits, including those benefits that were transferred in. And if those benefits transferred in had GMP, it's quite possible that the transfer received was not enough. So are you going to go back and try and get extra amounts from the transferring scheme if they haven't already contacted you to offer you those additional amounts? That's going to be a challenge in itself, particularly if you've got lots of transfers in. For transfers out, you've got 2 categories. You've got bulk transfers that happen between schemes, and those are usually governed by a commercial type contract. So you'll look at the contract first and see what the contract says. It may give you a clear line as to where the liability lies. Then you've got individual transfers, which was a case from last year in the courts, and where you've paid out unequal transfers, the onus is on the trustees to go back, try and find the data. Now, this is even more of a challenge because you've got people who have no longer got liability in the scheme. You might have some information for people who transferred out more recently, but if you go back further, you're less and less likely to have that information. So what else can you do? Well, since 2015, people who've transferred with more than £30,000 have had to take IFA advice. And arguably the IFAs have a vested interest in contacting those individuals and saying, we need to give you some advice because you're due some extra money. And then another thing that can be done is schemes can advertise to ask for members who have taken transfers in the past to come forward, as they may be due a little bit extra. Clearly that wording needs careful thinking, but that's something that can be done. Then there are other settlements, so trivial commutations, serious health lump sums, that you need to look at because you need to think about them in the same way as you think about transfer values. Then you've got insured pensions, so you've got bulk buy-ins, which again are governed by a contract with the insurer, the vast majority of which will have some provision on GMP equalisation. So you look at the contract, get your advice, and then follow that through with the insurer. Possibly some old contracts won't have covered GMP equalisation, then you'll need to get more detailed advice. You've also got schemes where they used to insure individual annuities at the point of retirement, and those policies are in the name of the trustees. Those are more challenging to deal with, as anybody who's been through a buyout knows. These are challenging to deal with in any event. Trying to deal with GMP equalisation is going to be even more of a challenge. And then you've got residual risk. So if you're going through, say, a settlement, a buyout exercise, either in the short term or at some point in the future, and you haven't been able to trace all those transfers and you haven't gone back to deal with all the deaths, you've still got some residual risk. So where's that going to end up? And there is no easy solution for that at the moment. The runoff insurers are not interested. These are known unknowns, things you ought to have known about. They're relatively difficult to quantify. So it's possible that you could get your employer to provide you with an indemnity. The employer might say no, or indeed you might not be confident that the employer is going to exist for long enough into the future. So hopefully the industry will find ways of solving that problem, but at the moment that's a big challenge. So moving on to stage 3, having thought about all the decisions we need to make as trustees and got the right advice, we then need to implement. Now, this is a problem of the scale we've seen in the last week of trying to get petrol. There's a long queue. And if you really need your petrol, if you need your GMPs equalised, you need to get a place in the queue. So my advice on this is get in line, get a number, get your place in the queue. If you're starting now, you're probably looking at least a year or two in the future. And we're just going to have to live with that as an industry. Now, there might be some drivers as to why you want to do this more quickly. So I had a scheme that was buying out, and there was an impetus to get the GMP equalisation project done quickly. And we spoke to the advisor and were able to prioritise this scheme. Clearly, you can't do that for every scheme. You may decide that you want to deal with some members early. So if you think about pensioners, the older pensioners, people who are over 90, say, you would like to, ideally, to make payments to them. Inevitably, they've got a limited lifespan at that age, so that they can enjoy them. So anybody who's due extra money, particularly those who are due larger amounts, you might want to prioritise them and deal with them quickly. Dovetailing with other projects I've already touched on, so you need to think about how your implementation of GMP equalisation is going to fit with anything else that you're doing. Again, this involves talking to your administrator. And then uploading data. So when you do the equalisation implementation, you're going to be taking an extract from the live system, you're going to be manipulating that to correct it, and then you're going to be uploading data back to the live system. Now, if you're just changing amounts in existing tranches, that's a little bit easier, but if you are converting and you're creating new tranches, the administrator has to set those tranches up on their system before you can upload. So that can be a complex process. So again, that's something you need to think about with your administrator. And then finally, once you've uploaded the new data, the corrected data, you need to think about how that affects calculation routines for the non-pensioners, because the transfer value calculation is going to be different, and the early retirement, etc., etc. Then I'm going to briefly cover complexity, so I've touched on some of this already. So what I hope I've done is summarised a few stages to how to break down your project, but you're also going to have to think about, unfortunately, anti-franking. Is that going to cause you a problem? Do you have to do something different for certain people? On the top right there, benefit costs. So there's the cost of the benefit cost of A versus B versus C versus D, but there's also the administration costs, and I also touched on administration risk. There are also issues around conversion in terms of taxation and potentially in relation to lifetime allowances. Data availability, again, can be an issue, and that might constrain how you go through the project and what assumptions you need to make. And advisor capacity, so not only your administrator capacity, but also the capacity of advisors helping you work through the implementation, the advice on the project. And I think Tom's going to come on and talk about this in a bit more detail. So taking all of that together, in summary, moving on to the next slide. So what I started with a bold premise that GMP equalisation projects are easy, and I think I've spent some time saying how you can break it down into chunks to make it easy, and then I've added a whole set of things that make it complicated, so apologies for that. But I think you really can genuinely make it easy by breaking it down into those phases or other stages that you think work. and that allows you to make some decisions. And as trustees, we can't sit and wait for too long. We have to be seen to be doing something, and it's the right thing to do. The courts have made their decision. So talk to your advisors, understand the wider picture in terms of other projects you're doing, make your decisions on methodology, make your decisions on the detail, and you can do that very easily. I've done this on a number of my schemes, and once you talk to your advisors, you can actually make the decisions very easily. There will be detail, and Tom will cover this. Think about other projects you're doing, think about segregating the members, because it might be appropriate to treat some of them differently, and then consider your implementation. Get your number, get in line, and that's really it. So I'll finish there and let Tom pick up on his experience.
Yeah, thanks, Akash, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people dialed in this morning. So, as Girish really said at the introduction, I spend a lot of my time working with some of the industry's early implementers of equalisation, and so what I'm going to try and talk about today is just some of the practical experience, and really just focus on some of the war stories, if you will, on the projects that I've been involved with. But before I launch into all of that, I thought it was worth just setting a little bit of context about why I think getting implementation right is really important. I think it's really quite easy to think that, this is just small beer for members. Let's just do something and call it good enough, and get on with our lives. And incidentally, we were actually, myself, Akash and Girish were talking just beforehand about the argument of why can't we just give everybody a check for 50 quid and be done with that, and why that argument doesn't work. And really, I kind of boil down that question of why is this so important down to really two things. So firstly, let's just for a moment take the assumption that all equalisation amounts are small as being true. Even if that is the case, the choice that is facing trustees and sponsors is one of either going through a process of making your administration much harder, much more complex, not just now, but many years into the future, the costs and risks of that, and the difficulties of communicating that complexity to members, or a choice to change members' benefits without their consent through conversion, neither of which is a particularly easy decision that can be taken lightly without due consideration. And then secondly, I also think generalizations about the size of payments to members, i.e., this is always small beer, it's a pint of beer or a tin of ham, can be quite helpful. And the cartoon on the slide is sort of brings that to life. It's the joke of the statistician who waded into a river that was on average 3 feet deep, only to immediately drown in a 12-foot hole. Or indeed the joke about actuaries that put their feet in an oven and their head in the freezer and say that on average that they're comfortable. I think the point is that day-to-day averages can be quite helpful in terms of making decisions, but we also need to be conscious of the limitations and the fact that they can be misleading. So to bring it to life, recent exercise I worked on, the impact at a scheme-wide level was quite small. It was less than 0.1% of the liabilities. 40% of the members in scope received absolutely nothing at all in terms of additional benefits. And even where members received something, I think the average back payment was about £200. But the largest impact on members was significant, and in some cases it was actually in excess of £10,000. So potentially a life-changing sum of money during the pandemic. The average amount, however, hugely misleading. Decisions in implementation are then going to drive just how complicated this exercise is going to be to run in the short term, but also, frankly, just how much members will receive, the quantum, but also how quickly members receive their benefits. Taking a very, very precise approach can push this exercise out for years and years. And for older members, that's obviously quite problematic. It'll also drive how these projects run off into the future and the risks associated with that. So the bottom line, I think implementation is really, really critical. So if we turn the slide, I think when we talk about implementation or calculations, it can often just sound like one thing, but I think it's just worth being aware that implementation isn't just one thing. It's not necessarily that straightforward. There are a number of different aspects to it that need to be delivered and coordinated. So if we all just suspend our disbelief for a second and imagine that we've got absolutely perfect member data, even if you have that, you still have to go through and construct the opposite sex benefits. Separately, you then need to calculate the back payments or the arrears to people who've been paid incorrectly in the past. You need to update your member event calculation, so how you're going to calculate your lump sums, your early retirements, your transfer values. You need to update the process for payroll, pension increases. So for dual records, that obviously now looks much more complicated, and again, even more complex again for C2 than for B, as Akash was alluding to earlier. For members whose benefits need to be converted, you need to do the conversion calculations with the certification. And then finally, obviously, you've got to communicate, both the implementation communications, but also updating your business as usual comms. And so I think in practice, one one of the challenges is around how schemes carve this work up, and where it is carved up, where the handoffs are, or frankly, whether you're better off handing the whole thing over to a single party to deliver. And I think in practice, we're finding that there isn't just a single right answer. Who's best placed to do what generally depends on what approach is selected, what method. So, obvious example, if it's conversion, then the scheme actuary necessarily has to have a reasonably significant role in certifying the results. If it's dual records, your administrator has to make some pretty significant platform changes. Equally, sort of where the work might sit kind of also depends on the principles that have been adopted for the exercise in general. So, is this about getting this exercise done as cost effectively as possible? Or is it about actually delivering something quite quickly on prioritizing members that have the biggest inequalities? Or actually you're trying to get the whole thing done to, say, facilitate a wind-up exercise or something more strategic? Ultimately, as Akash said, the industry is starting to form a queue. We're finding different providers are in different places with bandwidth and capacity. And generally, there will be elements that are going to be cheaper for one party to deliver than another. I do think that a key element, however, particularly for some of the larger schemes, is one of sort of flexibility. So the ability to call on different parties at different times to really spread the workload, particularly if business as usual administration is really sort of feeling the strain. But equally, we're finding for schemes in the mid-market, the ability to sort of limit handoffs and rely on a single provider can be really advantageous. So I think as a result, we're seeing a big range in terms of how schemes are actually tackling the implementation, from handing the project over to the administrators just to get on with end-to-end, or actually giving big chunks over to their scheme actuary, or indeed, in a number of cases, bringing in specialist advisors to run elements of the implementation. So what I'm going to cover in the next few slides really are just some of the learnings from those big exercises where we've been brought in, or I've been brought in as in an expert capacity, and how those learnings then might apply more generally to schemes. So I think the first thing to flag, and Akash touched on this earlier, is just the number of micro decisions that are required during equalisation. And that's kind of inevitable, but the important thing is having that clear process for how you're going to tackle these. How are you going to eat the elephant, to use Akash's sort of metaphor? So just to give you some sort of examples, data is obviously quite obvious. Lots of ways of dealing with data that you do and don't have. But I think even in terms of beyond that, implementing the methods themselves, we're finding that actually schemes that have looked really hard at implementing the default approach, C2, are finding it paved with complex micro decisions in terms of how it's implemented in practice that go, way beyond what was necessarily envisaged in that original Lloyd's judgment. Equally, conversion isn't one thing. Lots of different ways it can be designed depending on what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to achieve it. And in terms of those micro decisions, there's lots of ways that can all be tackled, ranging from trustees wanting to think through each and every decision and how each decision impacts members and the inequalities and so on and so forth, all the way through to basically passing it over to the advisors and saying, actually, we largely want you to get on with this within a certain framework. I think the important thing for trustees and for sponsors is really just understanding quite quickly what matters and what doesn't, what are the material decisions, and what is it quite easy to delegate, and then really focusing the attention, the efforts, the time, and frankly the budget on those decisions that make material differences to member outcomes. But I think overarching all of that, really, again, it's back to the eat the elephant metaphor, is just setting yourself up in the right way to tackle that problem. you need the right governance structure. So get your governance structure set up in the right way, navigate it effectively. Otherwise, you're going to risk being swamped trying to make all of these micro decisions when actually maybe 90 to 95% of them could have largely been taken care of by your advisors who've been there and seen it and done it before. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, I thought it was just running through some of the bigger implementation decisions, like some of the slightly more interesting implementations and why we're seeing schemes taking different approaches. So I think the first one is just on phasing. So there is definitely a neatness, right, of getting this exercise done in one go, just a once and done solution. Avoid people slipping between the cracks, avoid administrators running a two-tier system where some people are equalized and some aren't. And I think the smaller the exercise, the fewer the members, the more likely it is that you're going to want to go this way. For larger exercises where there's it's more likely that you're going to have a big chunk of tricky issues or problem cases that might need to be worked through in a bit more detail. If you hold off until you can do it all in one big bang exercise, then you risk either taking some very big shortcuts for those members and risk getting those answers materially wrong, or holding off for a significant period so that you can do it all in one go and keeping money out of the hands of pensioners who are being underpaid. So phasing, we're seeing a range of approaches, often depending on scheme size. On bulk calculation, so how much of it do you want to do up front versus how much do you just sort of bake into your future process? So, there are some elements where, you could take a decision that we're doing a lot of calculation work now. Why don't we try and make our future processes more streamlined, more effective and cheaper? So an example might be, calculating spouses proportions to put on the record rather than waiting until the member dies, going back to the record and recalculating. I think this generally comes down to kind of an overarching principle around whether you want to try and do this exercise in kind of the cheapest way possible in terms of how much is it going to cost me today versus the most cost effective way possible, which is, how much might this cost me over the next sort of 5 or 10 years. And, different schemes are in different places with that, with very, very good reason. In general, it is more cost effective to do work up front, but equally, obviously, there's a cost associated with that, and so it's cheaper to kick some of that down the road. Data philosophy is one area where we are seeing a huge range of views, and this is one that actually doesn't necessarily depend on scheme size. So some schemes are very much taking the view of, we want to minimize the amount of data work. The question is, what is the least amount of data that we can realistically get away with? Let's go away and get that, and let's manage cost. Some schemes are taking an approach of, let's touch a member once, i.e., if we're going to the backing file for that member, let's use that as an opportunity to take whatever data might be useful. And then finally, some are kind of seeing GMP equalisation, frankly, as the straw that has broken the camel's back on data and are doing a much broader data cleanse project that not only delivers the data for equalisation, but also for potential settlement activity. So I think getting a clear data philosophy up front is really, really, really critical. I've talked a bit about sort of cheapest approach versus the most efficient approach, but I think all of that really brings me nicely onto the final point, which is I think there is kind of a very natural reaction to say C2, it's the default, it's the lowest liability. Every administrator is going to need to be able to deliver this. It's got to be the answer. But I think Akash touched on this earlier. We are finding with relative consistency that schemes that have initially thought C2 is the clear answer have often found that when they've started considering and thinking through the complexity of delivering C2, the admin build, communicating it, and also running those calculations into the future and the costs, risks, and bandwidth around that, the B is actually not only a better option, but it might be a more cost-effective option too. The final thing then is Akash mentioned that some schemes are looking to combine exercises, and the fact that this is then going to be a much bigger implementation task to deliver. And so in that vein, I wanted to finish very briefly by just talking about some of the lessons that we've found from implementing conversion and pension increase exchange, because I think we are finding that these are two exercises that a number of schemes are looking to combine, either because they want to deliver a better member experience or because they're trying to generate some savings that more than offset the costs of delivering the overall exercise. And I think to Akash's point earlier, there can be some real benefits of combining exercises, whether it's equalisation and rec, or equalisation as part of settlement, or indeed equalisation as part of PI. And I think where it's successful, what does that look like? So I think the first sign of success of combining projects is getting high engagement for members. I think ultimately with these exercises, it's about putting members first. And typically, I think if you run this exercise in the right way, that you'll see higher than typical engagement rates from members. If you think about pension increase exchange, you're offering members a choice between two benefits. With conversion and PI, actually you're writing out to a member and saying your benefits are changing. How would you like that delivered? We're finding that if you deliver these sorts of exercises in the right way, that questions are the norm, but actually the questions are typically on the options available to the members rather than on the detail of equalisation and conversion. And really we're finding that the exercises that are well run have very little noise on conversion or on equalisation. And I think the way that you do that, and indeed the way that you manage an equalisation exercise properly, I think is by getting the communication right. Now, as many of you on this call will know, the requirements on conversion is that there's a number of statutory requirements in terms of what you have to say to members and by when. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the member, as we all know from some of the great work that's being done elsewhere in the industry, bombarding members with statutory information doesn't necessarily always make for the most engaging of communications. So it's really key to understand what and how you communicate to members to really get these sort of exercises landed in an engaging way. So I think from an implementation perspective then, if you want to deliver that sort of engaging experience, what are the keys to success? And I really sort of put it down to three things. The firstly is timeline planning. Now, this is key for equalisation full stop, but is even more important when you're combining conversion and PI. There's a bit of a sweet spot in terms of when you want to deliver these exercises, and to hit that sweet spot, you need lots of other things to fall into place: data, resource, legal advice, stakeholder alignment. So getting a robust plan in place is really important. Now we've got quite a few of these exercises underway. The IFA market therefore knows that this is all coming, but there is a lot of demand, and to Akash's point, actually getting in a queue, getting your IFA resource lined up is really important. Given these complexity of these projects, we'd be saying you want to get that done early, and actually IFA, being able to go to an IFA with a really robust plan can help everyone plan with confidence. And I know I've already said this, but it's so crucial that I'm gonna say it again. But you can have the best plan in the world, the best advice. You could have eaten pretty much all of the elephant, but ultimately, when it comes to member experience, the critical thing is going to be communications, because that's how the member is going to experience this exercise. And that is absolutely critical to effective implementation. And the bigger you make the project, the more important the communications are. Okay, so I think just to summarize before we go to questions, if we move on to the last slide. So as I said, implementation is not one thing. There's lots of different moving parts, and there's lots of decisions to navigate. However, that challenge is definitely not insurmountable, and it's certainly made all the more tackleable by the fact that early movers have now implemented. So there's a number of advisors out there who've been there, done it, and got it delivered. I think my experience from delivering these exercises, that really sort of the key is getting good governance. So how are you gonna eat the elephant? Getting the planning right. So you've got different moving parts to coordinate that all need to fall in line to make this a successful project. And then finally, it comes down to good advice and really focusing trustees very valuable time, sponsors very valuable time, and indeed budget and spend on the decisions that have a material impact on members. I will leave it there, and I think it's over to questions.
Yep. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Akash. That was excellent. I'm not 100% sure people are sitting back and saying, "Wow, that's really easy." But I think it's I think it's the approach, isn't it? How do you approach this? Because otherwise it's so complicated. So really appreciate that. There are lots and lots of questions, and I think we've only got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to pick out key questions which will sort of help the discussion. And I must lead with Robert Wakefield's question, because I think that a key part, especially as an administrator myself, is what about the administration? And I think his sort of view was, how do we make sure trustees understand the complications around administration? And if I can paraphrase a bit, because it's quite easy to get hooked into the methodology and the approach and forget about as you said, Tom, the data and the complexities around the administration and the administration implementation.
Yeah. So I think it's a really good question. There are huge challenges with administering these things. I think Akash, you said something about at some point in time all your administrators are going to be born after the cessation of contracting out, and that is spot on. I think there's a point around what is buildable today. We'll have a huge amount of energy behind it whilst we've got all these working groups and everything else, but there is a huge tail to this if you're running dual records, and everyone needs to be comfortable with the challenges of running that sort of tail. So my advice across the piece is to think really carefully about the decision between am I going for a big complex admin implementation, or am I going down the conversion route? And to be clear, conversion is no silver bullet either, but I'm not convinced it is necessarily all that astute to just default to a position of the court said C2, so the answer is C2, and I don't even want to think about it, because at that point, as I said, you're committing yourself to incredibly complex admin for the next, for decades potentially.
And just to add to that, I think the question there is, how do we as trustees understand the administrative consequences or implications of the decisions we make? And the easy answer to that is talk to your administrator. So I think there's a sort of default reaction when there's something complicated to do in pension schemes, that you talk to your actuary or your lawyer or both. Don't forget the administrator. The administrator's been there doing the detail on your pension scheme for a long time. They kind of know the detail, so do speak to them.
Yep. No, thanks. That's really useful, and especially from my perspective. The second question, I think, which would be really useful to the group, is a lot of trustees worry about where are we? Are we going too early? Are we have we not progressed enough? So where are in your experience in the industry, where are most schemes, and when should people be worried, and how many schemes have actually completed GMP equalization?
Shall I start? I think a lot of schemes have struggled to get going. I think more and more schemes now are realizing they can't sit and wait too long. Speaking as a professional trustee, I just can't sit on the sidelines. Clearly, the law requires me to equalise benefits, to equalise in respect to GMP inequalities. It requires me to pay the correct benefits to the right benefits, right people at the right time. And for me, this is what led to me thinking about the projects the way I do, is because I can't make implementation happen very quickly. There is a queue. There's a lot to do. The industry has a constrained capacity, but I can make decisions. That is what I get paid to do. So I can talk to my advisor and I can make the decisions on the methodology and some of the detail, so I can progress things that way. And then I can think about, are there some members where it's appropriate to prioritize them and pay them early or whatever. So yeah, I think schemes have struggled, and some probably are still struggling, but I think more and more schemes are realizing they just have to do something.
Yeah, so I think I agree with that, Akash. So if I think across the sort of our client base, what are we seeing? So there's a set of front runners that are basically done, and where they are basically done, it is often because they're a very, very large scheme and they wanted to get this done quickly, or perhaps they were approaching buyout, or there was some other commercial reason to get it done. So there is a small proportion of schemes that have largely got it done. I would then say there is a larger group, but still not enormous, of fast followers that definitely didn't want to be the first, but they wanted to be ahead of the pack. I think the situation we are in as an industry now is that the pack has started to move. So sometimes the analogy I use is that this is a bit like a marathon. So if we think about the marathon, you've got the sort of the elite world record holders have already crossed the line. The people in running clubs are well progressed on the race. Where we are now is the mass start, and actually a chunk of that is across the starting line. A fair chunk of that's across the starting line. I think if you're getting going now, you're still going to be in the pack. You might be towards the back half of the pack, but you're still in the pack. We're certainly not in the stage just yet where you're one of the fancy dress runners in a rhino suit that's sort of turning up sort of 6 hours late.
Sure, it should be an elephant suit, though.
Elephant suit, yeah, to use your metaphor. Yep.
Excellent. Slightly technical question here from Tim Smith. Where a scheme has a 6-year limit on making back payments, should the trustees amend their rules so the 6-year look back runs from the date of the first Lloyd's judgment, so members do not lose out due to the delays in payments?
So this is definitely an ask your lawyer question, and in part it depends on exactly how your words are ruling. Your rules are worded in my experience. I think in practice, schemes that have a hard-coded 6-year period in their rules will find that when they start looking at methods, it isn't just a case of members losing out. If you go down the C2 route, it makes C2 even more complicated and actually throws up a whole host of separate problems under method C2. So definitely, if you have that sort of wording in your rules, it's one you want to get engaged with on your lawyers pretty quickly.
Yeah, clearly it's a legal question. I mean, the way I've thought about it, and I've had legal advisors say in most cases that you can't use the rule as it is, and clearly you can change your rules as is suggested there. But I'd like to go back to first principles here, and what is that rule designed to do? I think it's really designed so that as trustees we're not left with bits of liability in respect of people we can't trace, and you can see some logic there. Whereas if we're paying pensions out to a pensioner, we know that when they retired, and therefore we know how far back we need to go. So I don't think the rule was trying to prevent us from making corrections.
Excellent. The next question, Anna Rogers from ARC, who says she believes B and C1 are simpler methods, but feedback seems to be that it's difficult to quantify the cost impact of different methods without actually doing the work. So is that right? What can trustees do?
Well, thanks, Anna. You're going to be buying the drinks tonight, then. So that's a little in joke. Yeah, I mean, clearly it's going to be difficult to calculate exactly the difference in cost. So I think here, this is where pragmatism comes in. I'd be interested to hear what Tom thinks about this. But if you're trying to compare the benefit cost between the two methods, yes, you're right, you would have to do a whole load of calculations to get the exact difference in benefit cost, but you could pick sample members that are appropriate for your scheme, think about how many in each category and do some sample calculations, and then that could help inform your decision without having to go to the nth degree and spend all that time and effort.
Yeah, so I agree with that, Akash. So my experience is that it kind of depends. So I've got, if I think across the schemes I'm advising, I've got one scheme where the difference between B and C2 is just demonstrably going to be tiny. It's only the most extreme cases where B will give you a bigger answer than C2, and you can get comfortable with that incredibly quickly by doing that sort of desktop review that Akash has suggested. I've also got a scheme where the cost of delivering B is, it's broadly double the cost of delivering C2. And to get to the place where you're comfortable that it's going to be about broadly double, you actually have to do quite a lot of analysis. So you can quite quickly see B is going to be more expensive, but to answer the question, how much more expensive, is quite hard. And you often find that where B is more expensive than C2, it's very, very contingent on assumptions. So I can make an assumption that says it's twice as expensive, but the challenge with B and C2 is that it depends on actual experience, right? So that's the whole point. It's a year-on-year check, depending on what actual inflation is. So even if you think it's double today, by the time all your members have had their benefits and died and we're all said and done, B could then be a lot more or a lot less than that. So it's about understanding the dynamic between B and C2 as much as the pounds amount. The final comment that I would make is that actually thinking about the implementation of these projects, there are bits of the implementation are broadly agnostic between whether you do B and C2. So actually there is some of the work that you can do that was already going to be part of your implementation that might get you closer to that answer. So it kind of avoids you spending a lot of money on something that isn't all that useful, because you might be able to take the decision on B versus C2 a little bit later.
Excellent. Couple of questions which are more process. So I'm just going to pick these up. So one was about whether the recordings of these webinars are going to be available, especially somebody who missed the one on transfers. So yes, they will be. It'll be on the PASA website. And then the second one was whether they can get a copy of the presentation slides. Tom, Akash, I'm presuming that will be okay?
Happy with that?
Yeah, I believe they're being shared, yeah.
Yeah, so if you can send an email to info@pasa-uk.com, we can share a copy of the slides. The next question, over the course since the first Lloyd's judgment, there's been a huge move between dual records to conversion, back again and back again, and one of the most important reasons why people thought conversion would be the preferred method is that insurers would all prefer conversion, and it would be much cheaper to insure benefits if you went down the conversion route. Are you seeing changes in that approach?
Certainly I know that in the early days of post-Lloyd judgment, a number of the insurers were saying they would prefer conversion to be the route. And that changed very rapidly when they realised the complications and the potential tarnishing by association, because whilst insurers will insure the benefits they're told to insure, they clearly have reputational risk that if something goes bad, that's why they do lots of due diligence on bulk annuities, then they could be impacted in terms of reputation. It was always going to be the case that all TPAs and all insurers would have to cope with the common methods that are going to be used. So it's effectively B, C, 2 and D, all the insurers can cope with. Some may express preferences, and there definitely seems to be ebb and flow of what's in vogue, where I think, conversion was trendy for a bit, and then it was C2, and now B is becoming probably most preferred, I think.
I don't disagree with any of that, Akash. I think it's right to characterise conversion as being an early preference amongst insurers, at least in my experience. And I think that was reflective of some of the mood music that was after the Lloyd's judgment. I mean, it certainly wasn't unilateral, everybody saying conversion was a silver bullet. I certainly wasn't of that view, but there were a number of people and commentators where that is the view. I think as the position has developed, as you say, the insurers by and large are in a position to deliver either right now or indeed at some point in the future, any reasonable solution that trustees might select. I doubt any of them will be delivering method A, though, as you said earlier.
I would expect that the cost of the buyout would be more impacted by any increase in size of liabilities than by the equalization method used.
Sorry, when you say, sorry, go on, Tom.
I was going to say, I think it's complicated, I think is the simple answer to that, and it depends on quite a few factors, size, complexity, so on and so forth. But you're right. I mean, part of the challenge here is that there were just with the buyout is that there were lots of moving parts and it could be quite hard to disentangle what's impacting.
Excellent, fantastic. Now we don't. I think we've just got 1 minute left, so maybe we'll just leave it with one last question. So, as you've gone through implementing GMP equalization, I mean, were there any key challenges that came up that you didn't expect, or anything you learned other than whatever you've covered already that people might find unusual that they wouldn't expect?
I see this kind of project very much like I've been involved in many bowel communities wearing different hats over the years. And what I always say about that is something always goes wrong. It always gets solved, but it goes wrong. And I think the same is true in my slightly less limited experience of GMP equalisation projects. Is something surprising comes out. It's something, maybe it's admin practice, maybe it's a particular complexity on anti-franking. But so far, those issues have been solved.
I'd agree completely with that. I mean, equalisation involves looking back over the past 30 years, and something is bound to crawl out of the woodwork. It's just being prepared to be able to navigate that.
Okay, thank you, Akash. Thank you, Tom. I think that was an excellent look at the implementation, how to make it simpler, the complexities, and Akash, you're absolutely right. I mean, we were talking about this just before the webinar, isn't it? Where Lucy said every webinar has some blooper, and of course today we started off with no countdown. So, and I think that's exactly what GMP equalization is like, isn't it? You've just got to go step by step, one bite at a time. We will face difficult things, and I think one of the great things we've got, with the pension regulator asking PASA to pull together a cross-industry group, and we've consistently come out with guidelines, information, communication about the different aspects, including these series of webinars. Akash, Tom, thank you very much for the time the two of you spend on the PASA working groups, helping this, as well as today for this event. So thank you. I'm sure everybody found it really useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.